Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for tuning in tonight on Facebook. I am super happy to be joined by Perry O'Brien and Phil Klay. It has been a long day in Houston with lots of hurricane prep. For those of you who are local, you know that it might have been a bit of a stressful day, but we are so glad to be able to do this event tonight. We also are still scheduled for our two events tomorrow, as long as we can continue to do them and we have electricity. So if you are watching and you're local, best wishes to you. Let's all get through a safe week. So before much more ado, I will introduce the two authors. So we're joined tonight by Perry O'Brien to celebrate his new release, Fire in the Blood. Perry O'Brien served in Afghanistan with this 82nd Airborne and was honorably discharged from the Army as a conscientious objector. He worked as a labor organizer in New York hospitals before becoming a founder of Common Defense, the nation's largest grassroots organization of progressive veterans. His fiction has been featured in the war anthology Fire and Forget, and his nonfiction has been published by the New York Times and the San Francisco Chronicle. Phil Klay is a veteran of the U.S. Marine Corps. His short story collection, Redeployment, won the 2014 National Book Award for Fiction and the National Book Critics Circle John Leonard Prize for Best Debut Work in Any Genre, and was selected as one of the 10 best books of 2014 by the New York Times. His nonfiction work won the George W. Hunt S.J. Prize for Journalism, Arts and Letters in the category of Cultural and Historical Criticism in 2018. He currently teaches fiction at Fairfield University, and if I'm correct, he has a new book coming out in October. Perhaps he'll tell us a little bit about. I'm going to go away and let these two gentlemen talk, and I'll be back in a little bit with your questions from the comments. So don't be shy. Pop some questions down there, and I'll get to them later. Thanks so much. You guys have a good talk.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having us. I'm so incredibly excited to be talking to Perry about his new book, Fire in the Blood, which we've been waiting for a long time. I remember I met Perry in 2009. I was just out of the Marine Corps, and we were in a vets writing workshop together, and he told us that he was working on a sort of murder mystery where the concept was a veteran or a soldier in Afghanistan learns while he's overseas that his wife is dead, and then sort of gets a certain amount of time to go back, goes back for the funeral, expecting that he's going to have to return to the war. And during that time, he's going to try and figure out exactly what had happened. We were like a bunch of us vets sitting around like, that sounds awesome. Like, we can't wait to read that, write it. And now we've got it, and it is even better than we thought it was going to be all those years ago. So Perry, I wondered if you could talk a little bit about. So obviously you were in the service. You served overseas, but there's a lot that's going into this book, and a lot that's not just about sort of war or New York, but there's also a lot of really subtle looks at issues of class and globalization, a lot of other things that I thought were really powerful. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the origins of this book, what went into it, and what it was that you were drawing on from your own life that led you to write it.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks again, Phil, for doing this. It's really awesome to have a chance to chat with you. And I'm glad the book was worth the wait 10 years later. Yeah, so I mean, originally, I think as I told you folks and the other, vets in the NYU Veteran Writers Workshop, the idea just originated with, while I was in Afghanistan, seeing, and working as a medic, seeing some vets who had these, some soldiers who had these family emergencies. And, obviously for our generation of service members, we didn't have that dynamic that you read about, or that we hear stories about in Vietnam, World War II, where people, came back from the front for brief periods of leave and then, went back to war, right? Like, you're deployed or you're not. So at the time, the idea of getting like a week or two of emergency leave after receiving a Red Cross message and getting this surreal, tragic absence from the war, where suddenly, you get outside of this this bizarre alternate reality that is modern war, and you're, you know, reckoning presumably with your family and back home, and you know, all the things associated with a homecoming. But it's just this brief momentary respite, and, you know, and then you're expected to jump, you know, right back into the war. And that fascinated me. But also, you know, as a lifelong lover of detective fiction, I was like, you know, but what if the death was, what if foul play was involved, or, you know, that there was a question about, you know, how much more complex would that be? And that, you know, that was what sort of, set off the original idea. And then, you know, I've been involved really since getting out of the military in political work, and it, you know, and I know this is something you and I and others have talked about a lot. It's, you know, I think very few people, with some exceptions, set out to write anything political in a way that's successful. Like my rule of thumb has always been that, you know, when people who try to make political art end up making bad art and practicing bad politics, because but that being said, you know, I think one's own values and analysis, you know, necessarily sort of suffuse what you're working on, and certainly through multiple iterations, as I went back to it, you know, I recognize, you know, as I guess every writer does, a lot of myself in my sort of view of the world.
Yeah, I think sometimes if you try to set out to write something political, where you have a concrete idea of what exactly you're going to say, oftentimes that leads to bad art. But I think that at the same time, if you carefully observe the world and describe it accurately, that's going to have some inescapable political conclusions, especially depending on where you allow your gaze to fall. And I think that's one of the things, you know, when I mentioned that there were issues that sort of arose as I was reading the book, it wasn't because I felt like you were preaching to the reader at any point. You were just describing reality at the time that you were writing it, and the sort of the reality of the various places that these characters are inhabiting and coming from. And one of the things that was just really kind of amazing to me, I think maybe the first thing that really struck me was, you know, this is set in the immediate post 9/11 period, and you get at that sensibility really, really powerfully. The sort of the weird paranoia of it. You know, you've got guys in Afghanistan, and they're worried about, you know, there are rumors that Saddam's WMD program, that he's like shipping WMDs to Afghanistan, right? Like, not even worried that they're, you know, which of course people were worried about, right? Not even that you know, they're worried there are WMDs in Iraq that they're going to have to deal with, but they're going to be in Afghanistan. You know, there's one of the characters talks about like rumors that there were, you know, terrorists were behind a space shuttle being being damaged, and they're talking about terrorists in space. And it's this sort of like sense of like paranoia and threat and rage, and also woundedness. There's a beautiful, I thought, lovely description of New York when he's coming back. This is now the taxi vaulted up onto a wide suspension bridge. Coop caught glances of hazy towers to the west, the skyline flashing between the bridge cables, city of all cities, the wounded capital of the war. Even at this great distance, Manhattan seemed to perch on the world like a crown, looming over the river and the huddled docks and port yards along the river. And I wanted to talk to you about why you chose to set this at that particular moment in time, and the kind of mood that you were going for.
Thanks so much. I mean, no, I mean, a lot of it was just that I was in New York, you know, during that time. So, but I think, you know, my experience not being from the city and not being in the city when the attacks happened, you know, but coming, you know, a few years later, after I was out of the Army, I mean, one of the things, you know, I mean, New York is, you know, the default setting, right? Other than maybe LA for thrillers, for crime, you know, films and books. But you know, all of that sort of like mythical weight to me felt super amplified when I first moved there, because I think, you know, particularly in post 9/11 New York, we were all living in a thriller, you know, that there was this sense that we were all protagonists in, like, you know, a terrorist plot or something, right? That at any moment, some conspiracy could lead to sudden, we would enter into like an action sequence and be running through an office building trying to escape, right? Like, I mean, there was this just, day-to-day terror of that and suspicion. But I also remember, I mean, it's hard to not laugh at it now, but, I remember that also being true in the military. I mean, some of those things I included are very real things that we were told to watch out for. I remember, we used to do all these in Afghanistan, as a medic, and we would do these kind of hearts and minds missions. And there was a week where we were given the heads up that there were Afghan children with anthrax needles that run up to us when we're like giving out vaccinations and like inject us with anthrax, in the arm or something, so the Kevlar wouldn't help. You know what I mean? Like that, and people were like talking about like what they would do in that situation, preparing. Which again, at the time, I mean, anything seemed possible in those early days, because the enemy was just this like phantom terror. You know what I mean? Terrorist
right.
linked to state sponsors. Anything seemed possible, but looking back on it now, I mean, that sounds absurd. It sounds like some kind of mad, supervillain, stuff.
Yeah.
Giving anthrax, needles to kids or something. But yeah, I mean, that just to me was so much a part of that time.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned in relation to the politics because it's one of those things where you're reading this and you're thinking like this is why so many things seem politically possible, right? Seem militarily sort of possible at the time because of that feeling. But it's also perfect for the kind of thriller that you're writing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think it really lent itself to, I guess that it's like we were all, and I think a big part of it that, again, not the kind of thing you set out to write, but in going back on it, particularly in later drafts, both the thriller genre, the paranoia around that, and the hypervigilance that so many of us and folks in our community experience after returning, that lasting hypervigilance combined with just the mystery of the war, of both the attacks,
right.
You know what I mean? That, this like, yeah, again, I feel like there's a way that we were all detectives and all thinking like action heroes or like, protagonists in a political conspiracy thriller. So yeah, I think that the conventions of that genre and both, because I love those books, just sort of automatically came into play.
Well, this also, I'm just, as I'm talking to you, I'm thinking about it now that in the way that you wrote this, there, and that you talk about that sense of uncertainty, it's not necessarily uncertainty about what happened, right? Like we all sort of knew what happened on 9/11, but the way that you write the story, it's a kind of inverted mystery. From the very beginning, from the opening chapter, we know who killed Coop, your main character's wife, right? So when he comes back and the sort of mystery that he's trying to uncover, it's not necessarily for the reader what happened, it's the context of what happened, right? And not just the context of what happened, but because his wife is killed, other people acting in that same sort of space of paranoia and a sense of threat and anger and sorrow all mixed together, they're taking actions that sort of compound the problems, right? That make the situation more dangerous, more deadly. And it feels as though you've written a sort of really tightly wound, intense sort of microcosm of what was going on more globally.
Yep. No, that's so apt and really, you're picking up things that took me a long time in writing it to be reflective about myself. That, I honestly, people kept asking me, why do you want to put all this information up front, right? Why do you want to just lay out the scene of the death instead of hold that open? You know what I mean? Particularly given that your main character is going to have, that's going to be a mystery. Isn't that going to open up this big sort of gap between the reader and the main character in terms of identifying? And I honestly couldn't, I'm sure I had like a BS structural argument for it, but it's like be honest, I was just fixated on that approach, and it wasn't until much later that I was like, oh, duh, 9/11. You know what I mean? Like trying to, this catastrophic, thing that felt like life is, the world is coming to an end, and we knew what happened, right? Very quickly, we had the. And we even had something resembling a motive, even if the motive felt incomprehensible. But I mean, you nailed it perfectly. The context, I think, for so many people remains a mystery. And unfortunately, our, pursuit of that mystery, the way that we sort of grasped around in the dark with our fists, trying to solve that, I think has led so much to, a political context that we're still, suffering the consequences of and still sort of, stuck in.
Right. And the sort of politics of rage and fear still certainly operative in American life today. So, early on in the novel, so the first chapter, so, we find out how Coop's wife is killed, and then we're with Coop in Afghanistan, but it's not. It's kind of a quintessential war story that you start out with. Which, do you want to sort of describe it to the reader?
Yeah, you mean the horse thing and
yeah.
And that for a while, for a long time, probably maybe even in a draft that you read, that was actually the opening thing. And
right.
And again, just one of these things I was sort of fixated on. I remember, and this is a good indication of how long I've been working on this book. I remember when Hurt Locker came out, I was like, oh no, this is too, so Coop is out on a mission, and they identify this sort of roaming, they spot this roaming horse out in the middle of nowhere. And speaking of the paranoia of the time, or just the by necessity increased vigilance, there's this concern that it might be an animal-born explosive. And so Coop kind of, after some deliberation, volunteers to go out there and sort of inspect the horse, and because he's a combat engineer. And yeah, again, it was just one of those things I sort of got fixated on, and I think I liked the kind of Western quality to it. And even after going back to it, there are parts.
Well, and they're challenging him to ride it.
Right.
Yeah. They think it might be a bomb, but they also think it would be cool if he wrote it.
Exactly.
And it's
which is resonant with my. On one hand, there's this deep fear of dying or being mauled in a potentially improbable way, and then on the other hand, this sort of like well, this could make a cool story if we did our own recklessness to the situation.
So there's this sort of just like that absurdity and sort of soldiers acting kind of dumb in a situation that doesn't necessarily make sense and that they don't necessarily understand. And then, he gets the news. This novel just moves, and it's really kind of powerful and gripping. Like once I started reading this, I could not stop. And he's supposed to get leave to go home to his wife's funeral, but because it's the army and everything gets jammed up in weird bureaucratic issues, he ends up in this sort of like bureaucratic limbo, waiting for a ride, and he has to essentially bribe somebody to illegally send him home so he can get it home in time for his wife's funeral, rather than wait for the army to figure out how it has screwed up his orders, which by the time that would happen, he would have missed his wife's funeral. So he has to do something wildly illegal, which is essentially like deserting the war, but only in order to do something the army should be doing for him anyway. And I sort of love that, because he's in this period where he's basically like, he comes back home with this sense like he needs to get back before anybody figures out what has happened, before his role in this particular screw up becomes clear. So it adds a kind of extra pressure to his time while he's in New York. But it's also sort of, there's this, we're talking about that sense of threat and the need to do something, the need to respond, versus like what that response actually looks like on the ground, which is this a bunch of young kids who don't know what they're doing, kind of screwing around in the desert, and this vast bureaucratic machine that is a total mess.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny. I've had a number of folks say, look, this just feels implausible that just and I'm
Not at all.
I wish I could tell you that it was that a person wouldn't be allowed to go to their own, spouse's funeral because of a paperwork issue. But God, far greater losses have occurred for far smaller clerical errors or, miscommunications or whatnot. Yeah, I mean, and that I think is the other thing of like, yeah, being in the hands of sort of petty bureaucratic gods who on one hand have like this literally unlimited budget and this, can like call down hell from the skies, you know what I mean? But on the other hand, like can't get someone back, on a plane to, even if everyone agrees that that person should probably be given the right to do that. And for me, yeah, the idea of like him, taking this, I just, again, like if there's something that felt right about him taking this really high stakes, action that really sort of puts him outside, his, fellow soldiers and outside the kind of like protective arms of the military, puts him quickly outside that, but having to do it for like a really dumb reason. There was just something about that that felt really right.
Yeah. That was beautiful. I also loved, when he just gets back and you have these descriptions of that feeling of coming back that were just, like the first thing that he does when he gets in is he goes to the bathroom, right? His first priority after arriving in New York was to use a real toilet. For 7 months, he'd been stuck with the claustrophobic reek of porta-johns, right? And so, he's like in the men's room at LaGuardia. It's like, this is happening. The men's room at LaGuardia. How wonderful, And then he's walking down the street. And I was wondering if you could just read, starting on page 55, the paragraph that begins at the bottom as he walked, and just the next, that paragraph and the next two.
All right. As he walked, Coop did a slow 360 every minute or so to check his rear, trying to keep it nonchalant. He imagined himself at the center of a geometric flower, direct bullet paths and graceful mortar arcs, vectors of potential attack radiating from a million points of origin. Bar rooftops, windows, the highway, the airstrip of snow and blue lights. Yet the cars all followed one another in an uninterrupted line, edging together in the imagined safety of their vehicles, not understanding that a bomb of sufficient power would kill them all and mix their pieces together in fire. Coop wondered how they could all be so stupid, especially in this city where the war had started. Wait, you want me to keep going?
I think we can stop there. I thought that was great. And just that sense of like the everyday normal things that are like you think you're safe, right?
Yeah, and the resumption of, I mean, that, and again, I think that was probably what was so, surreal again for all of us, not just people in the military, of just that on one hand, holding these, deep and not entirely unfounded fears of violence, and I think, look, I think so many of us feel this way out with everything from, shootings in schools and theaters, and then of course there are, substantial, portions of, our, fellow Americans who have to fear violence every single day from, at the hands of law enforcement, as we're, once again seeing, so unjustly and so tragically and so infuriatingly. And I think that has just become, the resumption of the day-to-day, I think is something that it's funny that I feel like, I don't know if this was like a vibe that you got to in the military, but it's like on one hand, we're meant to really like loathe the complacency of the civilian, but on the other hand, we're supposed to embody the like chill every day, like totally fine with maybe getting blown up today. You know what I mean? Like we're supposed to be extremely, complacent in that, like, you can't be actually worried about all the things that you're supposed to be training and preparing for, right? Like you would be, it would be impossible to function, right? And yet we're sort of trained to be mad at civilians for not, constantly imagining those fears too, or acting as if those are imminent.
Yeah, it's one of those weird things, like, because like those signs like "complacency kills" is one of the slogans, and I never understood it, because in theory, right? In theory, the whole reason we're doing what we're doing is so that civilians can be complacent, right? Like, that's the whole point of the thing, is that people in New York are not supposed to have to worry about being blown up, being shot, being killed. And then you're also supposed to be contemptuous of them. It's like
they enjoy peace of mind.
Yeah. You'll see this sort of like, it's a particular, you'll see it from sort of sometimes some of the more reactionary vet public figures who like to adopt this attitude of like, I can't believe I risked my life for you, worthless people. It's like, if you don't respect Americans, dude, like, that's sad for you. I wish you were more patriotic.
It's so much more alive now. I mean, the conspiratorial, the like oogaloo people about how obvious it is that we're headed into, an all-out, second civil war. You know what I mean? Like, there's the same kind of like, how naive of you to not know that we're about to descend into armed conflict, within our own borders. And yeah, I mean, I think it's really, I think it's a really disturbing political trend that in some ways, at least for me, like the first place that I saw that was within the military.
Mm-hmm. Now to go to another thing in the book that feels like it has contemporary issues. You wrote this well before the current era. Coop's wife is from a very wealthy New York family, very connected, very wealthy, and whose ancestors were fairly straight up fascist. But when did you write this?
I mean, that angle of the Belantes, I think was, early teens, 2011.
Yeah, because I think I saw an early version of this with this and this.
Yeah.
And the one of the things that's really interesting in the book is, the narrator and the various characters are moving through various different worlds. There's, drug addict, sort of drug clinic, social workers. There's this kind of sort of wealthy finance family, cops, and you're sort of seeing the connection between these different classes and the ways in which they depend upon each other, or are responsive to each other, or prey off one another. And that again feels like not necessarily an area where you're trying to be political so much as observant about the ways in which there are these different spheres within New York that sometimes feel like they're totally isolated from each other and yet are part of the same system.
Yeah. I mean, I think maybe like the two bumper sticker sounding thing is that, again, after reading, just that, I think I do believe that systems of exploitation make, us all into collateral damage, in the way that we talk about, and make us all sort of combatants in a very violent system whose intent is not necessarily our destruction, though obviously there are some populations that, folks in power or folks who feel their power slipping away target for destruction more than others. But yeah, I mean, I think it's easy to go too far with this, but I just more and more think our current political climate shows that these endless, these forever wars have, forced, like, rather, we talk a lot about the military civilian divide, and what I worry about is that you know, I think there are a lot of reasons to be worried about that growing, but what I worry about is the civilian collapsing into the military. I worry about the encroachment of attitudes and orientations toward conflict in society and fear and violence that, you know, I thought were extreme, you know, among fellow trained, you know, perpetrators of violence, you know, but now I think are unfortunately sort of every day. And yeah, I worry about the, and again, it's unpacked, but like the militarization of, you know, the way that we all think, you know, whether it's being worried about, you know, being shot, going to a movie theater, or, you know, being worried about your kids in school, or the way that we view people with different political opinions as potential combatants against us. Maybe.
Yeah. You know, in addition to that sort of sense of sort of threat, and almost a sort of, it's not just seeing the other as an enemy, but like wanting the other to be an enemy, right? Like sort of taking pleasure in the sort of simplicity of that division. There's the influence of sort of greed, right? Sort of predatory systems. And one of the nice things that you do in the book is you sort of see it in various different arenas, right? So you have these kind of like Eastern European gangsters, right? And one of whom emerges out of sort of formerly cloistered Albania, where with the support of Western countries and guidance from the IMF, President Berisha threw open the gates of Albania, and soon there was a frenzy to participate in the free market, right? And there's this sort of rush, and then a variety of essentially like pyramid schemes that take people's money, leaving a sinkhole that swallowed the country's savings. And under advisement from the International Monetary Fund, President Berisha had declared that there would be no compensation for the scheme's victims. After all, he said, the blame ultimately fell on those who had made poor investments. And you have this sort of really kind of nasty kind of gangster figure, but who's also, in some ways, you get a sense that he is embodying a sort of an ethic that he learned, you know, in the way that the system was sort of like, it's about getting in there, it's about making the buck. Those who fall by the wayside, whose lives are destroyed by bad actors, it's their fault for not being aware of how the system worked, even if it was a totally new system. And that sort of predatory attitude that had been sort of pushed at that time, he adopts at home. You have this very interesting discussion of like a drug clinic and the relationship to sort of like funding schemes tied with sort of public-private partnerships around healthcare. And it seems like sort of woven through these things is not just that sort of sense of paranoia and threat, but also a sort of like almost like predatory capitalist mentality that justifies even pretty extreme degrees of predation.
Yeah. No, and it's, I mean, I think, yeah, predatory is really the word for it. I mean, I think, to me, I think I think we, sometimes in our politics, we talk too much about the financial world and, you know, Wall Street as like gamblers or gambling. But like gambling's pretty innocuous on the scale, you know what I mean? In the grand scheme of things. I mean, obviously people should not gamble with public goods, right? We should not gamble away, right? But the, you know, folks, whether in Albania or the US, that were responsible for so many people experiencing, you know, impoverishment, like it's not that they gambled and lost, right? It's that like there is a preying on people that is happening, right? I mean, as like another group, of course, that is targeted for this kind of financial exploitation that still amazingly so many people don't know about is vets. Like we're like the number, we're like the easiest marks, you know what I mean? In the like, you know, we were going to use like really, I don't know, cliche, like naturalistic things. We would be the like big-eyed doe in the middle of the forest, I'm like, oh, great, I get to come out, right? And like, I mean, I'm sure, we both had the experience of that when I came back from Afghanistan, everybody would go out and buying, used cars that, getting in debt. And, I mean, even Trump University, for instance, right, this is a model, the for-profit, online university thing with these like worthless degrees and all that fraud. I mean, veterans have always been the first target for that because
GI Bill.
Yeah, exactly. GI Bill, and then disposable income and like, a culture that does not genuinely, despite all the safety briefings that we get about not used car lot with our combat pay, somehow doesn't overcome I think a cultural orientation towards short-term rewards because you don't know if you're going to get the long-term ones,
Yeah. So you have these separate worlds. You have sort of drug addicts, you have drug dealers, right? And their connection to sort of overseas. You have the world of the army, you have sort of wealthy financial family. They all get tied together, but there's also, one of the things that I thought was very interesting is there's a sort of, they're not just the classes that people come from, the sort of social roles that they can inhabit. And as, one of the really interesting bits in this is there's a drug dealer who sort of tries to get clean. His name is Sean, who starts out as an art student, right? And I'll just read from, he's at Pratt. At Pratt, Sean had rapidly come to understand that in the art world, being Black put certain obligations on his past. Instructors always wanted to talk to him about where he'd grown up, what his childhood had been like, how he'd become interested in art, as if he must be some kind of refugee, someone who made it out. And upon revealing his roots in suburban New Jersey, how his parents were still together and his older sister worked in real estate, Sean always caught the scent of disappointment at the unspecialness of his achievement, right? And, it's this sort of like this pressure that's put on people to sort of fit them into particular type of class roles that then people have to navigate as they're moving through. And one of the things about Coop, your narrator, and sort of the sort of interesting way that Sean navigates that as you follow him. Coop, because he's a veteran, has these different styles, right? These different things that he learned in the military. And you associate them with geographic regions, one of which is Texas, which is the one that he uses to bamboozle the wealthy family. Do you want to explain those styles?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean,
I feel like since we're doing a Texas event.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I mean, being a Mainer who had not like traveled, I did some traveling as like a teenage miscreant, but not a ton. Certainly hadn't spent a lot of extended time outside of New England. The military is such a crash course in the different like nations really that comprise our singular nation. And
right.
It's funny how people, I think much like anything else, where you try to strip people of their identity, people start sorting themselves. And I noticed in basic training, I'd meet people and they would have this super thick Southern accent that would kind of just like fade a little bit over time, And, like I had never been called a Yankee before. I was like, still a thing that happens, like.
The other thing you'd find is like, there'd be people who had a slight Southern accent who like, like first sergeants or whatever, were not from the South. Yeah.
And that's exactly it, is that there's these performative, regional things that I think get enmeshed in military culture, right? And that there's just these like specific and like the true authentic expression of it is if you get to be, both in the military and to say that you're from Appalachia, right? You grew up hunting, you know what I mean? You have this like, special affinity for a certain part of
right.
A certain virtue that we uphold in the military, right? But yeah,
the New Yorkers are the hustlers.
Exactly.
Right. The guys with like a side dealer who can sort of fix you up with something, you know.
Totally. The like supply sergeants who just like know how to make things happen and work.
Right.
You know, and again, it's like people just start exaggerate. Like, I think this was how I connected to, you know, or tried to frame Sean's experience, because, you know, friends of mine who are people of color talking about that sort of like the performative authenticity of your background, you know, like reminding you so much of in the military, you know, that there's both a pressure in the military to kind of like assume the most pure form of a geographic. And again, for all kinds of, you know, historical reasons, I feel like New England is kind of left out of this, to people kind of don't, like, what, you're supposed to be a lobsterman, or, you know what I mean? Like, people don't even know what the accent sounds like, you know? But so many other parts of the country, there's just this sort of, you know, you start to like hyper identify with where you're from in a way that I'm sure, you know, that folks never would back home. And I think in the same way, you know, there's ways that you know, that folks are pressured to be, you know, more, whether like, more Texas, more California, more, you know,
And do you want to describe Texas?
Yeah. So I mean, for me, my association with Texas is just all of the sort of big spectacle of the military. You know what I mean? The like the parades, the kind of you know, excessive and, I don't know, sort of blatantly false, you know, exaggerated etiquette. Like for instance,
The clean cut. It's like the clean cut, like, yes, ma'am, that sort of thing. All right.
Started saying yes, ma'am in the military until, you know, a waitress was like, I'm younger than you. Why the fuck are you calling me ma'am? You know what I mean? Because I had just been around so many Southerners, and of course, just like, you know, yes sir, yes ma'am to officers. I just like picked up this weird Southern thing that had nothing to do with who I was or how I thought you talked to people, you know?
Yeah. So it's like, he's like, how am I going to negotiate this tough New Yorker? It's like, I'm going to go with like the sweet, earnest, yes, ma'am. It's a fantastic scene. Whereas the lesson that he's told is before he even joins is well, maybe I'll just read this section. He meets this, like, is he a homeless vet, Jared?
Yeah, he's like kind of a gutter kid.
And he's like, you resemble a smart young man. Tell me, did George Washington ever kill a man? He's like asking about these officers. He's like, officers, like generals, they never get their hands dirty like Eisenhower. Did Eisenhower ever kill anybody? No. 5 stars, but not one single kill. Jared took a swig of his malt liquor. You know who wins wars? He said, it's the criminals. People who know how to hurt people and break shit. People like me. And then the next line is, later, if Coop had to pick a single reason why he joined the army, he'd always think of Jared.
Yeah. And that's what fascinated me so much about being, I mean, to me, it's like so many of the things you learn in the military, right? Like once you get past the training and there's the whole, like, if you're not cheating, you're not trying, you know, the skills you learn about navigating a kind of like authoritarian system that I think a lot of people probably, you know, compare to like various states of incarceration, you know, you know, like, and then of course, all the skills that end up actually mattering, whether it's, you know, whether you're just, you know, serving stateside or deployed, you know what I mean? Like, you know, so often it's like the kids who like grew up getting in real fights, you know what I mean? Who like know how to fight when, you know, it comes to combat, right? It's like, you know, kids who, you know, maybe like stole cars and that's why they know how to, you know, repair your fucking Vietnam era Humvee when it breaks down in the middle of Afghanistan, you know what I mean? Like there's all these skills that come into play, and there's a real reverence, I think, for a kind of like outlaw mentality, which to me is fascinating that lives alongside the like squared away soldier or Marine with the, you know, immaculate haircut and the like rules abiding, you know, like gleaming medals on the chest, that those two things are completely, you know, that the military has found a way to harmonize those, you know what I mean? That, you know, you're both managed to be like, you know, a perfect golden patriot, but also like a ruthless perpetrator of all the social norms.
Right. One of the funny things when during these wars, they were having difficulty filling the ranks. They started giving more waivers, right, for people who had crimes of, usually small stuff in their background. And one of the things that they found is that the people who I forget the name of the waivers, it's like morality waivers or something like that. The folks who had come in with one of those waivers, yes, like that cohort of people, there were more disciplinary issues with those, like, but there were also like a lot more medals for valor at the same time, like, right. There's a certain thing you're bottling, and it's kind of unstable, right?
Yeah, there's a great in Doctorow's The March, which I know you and I both.
That's a great book, yeah.
One of my favorites, which I recommend to everyone, about Sherman's March. There's a great passage where he talks about one Union soldier's affinity for urban combat being learned in gang warfare, and why that makes him, a terror to the Confederates on the march, because he grew up in these street fights and figured out how to take up like lookout positions using urban architecture and whatnot, and something to think about.
Yeah. And so if we have questions from the folks on Facebook, I can't actually see that. If you have questions, you can definitely be writing them down. I think McKenna's going to jump in if we have those.
Yeah.
Oh, we do. Okay.
Yeah, we do. Can you guys hear me? Yes. Okay. Perfect.
Yeah.
So a couple bits of housekeeping first. If you tuned in and missed the beginning of this chat, you can go to our videos tab on Murder by the Books Facebook page, and it'll play. You can play it from the beginning. Once this video is done, we'll also be uploading it to YouTube in the next couple days, and posting on social media to let you guys know that it's up there if that's an easier place to view it. We do have a question from Jennifer. Do you have a favorite place you like to write your book or books? And I think that could go to both of you.
Oh yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I feel like the official writer answer is to like not get it, like, other than the sort of Spartan ritual of going back to the same place to like activate the magic, that you're like not supposed to be too precious about the place, like don't have a nice view or something like that. But I also feel like sometimes a nice view can be really, I mean, I don't know, I've written a lot of places. I like the Saco Public Library in Maine was a good spot for me. And then like, I like public libraries a lot personally for like, mix of like seclusion, finding like a dusty corner. Maybe there's something about being surrounded by books. But yeah, that's probably my favorite. What about you, Phil?
Yeah. Also just been in the library. I think actually you mentioned Doctor, you talked about how like when you're doing research for a book, like if you're in a library, what happens is you're walking around and then your knee like knocks a book off the shelf accidentally, and it turns out to be exactly the one that you needed. I always wish I had like some grand, writerly technique, like skin an ostrich and make ink out of its blood. And but like I got 3 kids, I just write wherever the hell I can, whenever I can. One thing that I did like to do was writing the book coming out in October, like, because it's easy to get like kind of bottled up in your craziness. And I'd go for a run to a park with like just like a little backpack with a notebook in it, and it's like a notebook like this, and a pen, and then I'd sit under a tree or whatever and write. I'd sometimes have a book too, so I could read, and nothing else. And so I'd write for an hour or two, and then I'd run home and type up what I'd written, and that was always a very pleasant. I don't know if the writing was better, but it was a very pleasant way of doing it.
That sounds super healthy.
yeah.
So I don't know how to take this. There's some banter back and forth and someone talking about heckling. There was an original question from Matt. I want to know what Perry's working on now. And someone else said that question's absurd. I don't know. I don't think it's absurd. Perry, what are you working on now?
I am starting to sort of put together the architecture of a second novel that I'm excited about, sort of in a similar genre. I definitely have the right release superstition about not talking about it until it's at least have a little bit more progress. I really do.
Fair enough.
I feel like my best mentors taught me early that there's something about you put it, because honestly, I'll tell you the number one thing is if you have a good idea and you put it out there, it's almost like someone's gonna steal it. Like, and I don't even mean steal it, like someone else is gonna like have the idea. So if there's anything your like concept that you're really excited about, I feel like I've seen this happen again and again. And I have so many friends that have said where they just have some like great topic or something, and then they just find out someone across the world like after they had a conversation. I don't know. I feel like there's something about like opening the box that, you know, yeah.
Except you told us all your concept, and I think even Jake, our buddy Jake, who's this Army vet with like an incredible voice, was like, "I give you 2 years, or I'm going to steal that idea," you know. And
it's been very kind to.
And we gave you 11.
I know. I get extensions. Yeah.
It was worth the wait.
So, totally off topic, but a funny question. Do either of you have pets?
Yes, I have a dog and 2 cats. My dog is a half Frenchie, half pug named Oscar. And then we have 2 cats, Freya and Sparkle. Sparkle has an Instagram if people want it.
I got 3 children. That's enough wild animals for me.
I have my own dog who is also the store dog, Maisie Dogs, and she too has an Instagram, so I can get behind that.
I love dogs. We can't have them in the apartment, but especially my 2-year-old would love that, because every time we walk by a dog, he'll just go like, "Can I touch it? I touch it," you know. Because sometimes people will let him touch the dog, and occasionally he'll say that with dogs where you're like, that one, no.
Yeah.
So the bookseller and me, you guys have had a fascinating in-depth discussion about the book, but I was wondering, Perry, if you could give me like an elevator pitch for it, just so for those people who are not familiar with it, tell me about your book.
Yeah, great question. So it is, we've talked a little bit about the plot, but it is in some ways, sort of classic detective thriller set against the backdrop of both the war in Afghanistan and post, 9/11 New York, about a soldier whose wife dies suddenly while he is overseas, and he comes back to New York, and the whole novel takes place over the 2 weeks that he's in New York trying to figure out what happened, while reckoning with, all of the challenges of any returning soldier.
Yeah, excellent. So it's not the easiest thing to do, so great job. And Phil, it's your turn. Tell me about the book that's coming out in October.
Sure. It's called Missionaries, and it is set in Colombia. It has 4 characters, follows 4 main characters. One is, she's a journalist who starts out in Afghanistan. One's a special forces guy who spends time in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Colombia. One is a Colombian lieutenant colonel in the special forces, and one is a kid from a poor region in Norte de Santander. And in this sort of rural region that has experienced a lot of violence over the years, whether paramilitares, guerrilla, or communist insurgent groups, or drug dealers. And it's really about the way these things intertwine. So if you imagine a raid led by Colombian special forces in like a poor region against a drug dealer, right? They're watching this guy using US-made drones, using tactics taught to them by Americans and aided with American technology, using tactics that were sort of honed to lethal perfection in Iraq. right? And the sort of, when they go in and kill somebody in this one region, it sets off a kind of chain of events that has kind of repercussions around the world, because we often talk about war as if sort of an isolated thing in one region, but America projects power around the world. It provides technology, assistance, and all sorts of lethal know-how around the world, and those things migrate. And so it's about sort of the globalization of violence, you could call it, and the ways in which one sort of targeted assassination in a rural region of Colombia will bring together these four characters and change their fates.
Fantastic. So David asks, Perry, if your book was made into a movie, who would play the lead?
Oh, that's a good question. Oh God, that's tough. Man, I will have to think about that. That is an excellent question. I'm not sure. I haven't really had anybody in mind. I feel like I don't know. I feel like it's hard to answer because I don't know actors that are Coop's age. I feel like most of the actors I'm familiar with, but I guess that's something that people can. I don't know. I would love to hear people's suggestions.
Okay. Not Timothy Chalamet. I'm not a good one for actors. Adam Driver could do it.
Oh yeah, that's right. He's in Rockbat, and yeah.
He's a Marine, former Marine. He's got that sort of intensity. Yeah, I don't know.
All right, and this is actually something I was wondering too, but someone just asked, Jessica asked if you could tell us more about Common Defense.
Yeah, oh yeah, very happy to. So Common Defense is an organization, a national organization of progressive veterans. I am one of the co-founders. The organization emerged pretty organically during Donald Trump's original campaign, running the Republican primary. I think a lot of us in the military and veteran community were really alarmed at the way that he was using veterans and to sort of wrap himself in the flag. A man who really has never served anyone but himself. It was more so than politicians of either party, I think, in recent memory. Claiming this enormous support within the military veteran community while advancing policies that were fascist, right? Anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant policies, particularly during the campaign, and has since, despite claiming to be non-interventionist, has obviously, led us right up to the brink of war. I could go on, but so the organization is, about 150,000 folks around the country who, veterans, military family members who come together, through everything from grassroots traditional protest and direct action to legislative advocacy. We endorse candidates, and we also have a political action committee, and we will be working very actively, particularly in the states of Maine, North Carolina, and Arizona, to take back the Senate and the White House.
Can you do some in Texas too?
Yes. Yeah. No. We've actually endorsed there's some fantastic candidates we've endorsed in Texas that we're really excited about. And we have a lot of great Texan members who want to be part of the big change that I feel like Texas is on the brink of. So yeah, everybody makes it through the hurricanes and and everything else that you folks are facing. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And before I had a chance to, we have a couple people who've dropped the link to Common Defense website. So if you're interested, that's in the comments as well. So I think actually it's probably time to wrap up. I'd really like to thank Phil for taking time out of his schedule to do the interview today. It was, I can say it's not the easiest job to moderate an interview necessarily, and that was a fantastic job. So thanks so much to you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
And of course, thanks to Perry for joining us. Congratulations on your new book. All best wishes to both of you. I have the link in the comments if you'd like to order. Actually, either of their books, including the forthcoming release, Missionaries. So that's all in there. You can just click there for more information or to order. And everyone in the path of natural disasters right now, stay safe. Thank you so much, and you guys have a great evening.
Thanks so much. You too. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
And thanks to everybody listening in.